What if the most important game of the WNBA season wasn't played on a hardwood floor, but inside a locked boardroom? No cameras, no press conference, no social media posts. Just a quiet meeting that, according to insiders, wasn't even supposed to exist. Because somewhere behind closed doors, with the 2026 season looming and the CBA opt-out ticking like a countdown clock, something shifted. Not publicly, not officially, but unmistakably. The tone changed, the urgency changed, the math changed, and at the center of that shift, Caitlin Clark, not lacing up for a logo 3, not stepping into a packed arena, not breaking another ratings record, but allegedly drawing a line. For months, the public conversation has focused on highlights, rivalries, physical play, and television numbers. But quietly, beneath the noise, the real story has been building. The kind of story that doesn't trend immediately. The kind that makes executives uncomfortable. The kind that forces commissioners into emergency strategy sessions. Because this isn't about one bad foul. It isn't about one controversial whistle. And it isn't about a rookie contract anymore. It's about leverage. The WNBA just secured a multi-billion-dollar media rights agreement with major broadcast partners. Attendance surged. Merchandise sales exploded. Road arenas sold out at levels the league had never experienced before. Television ratings hit historic highs. And the face most consistently attached to those numbers? Clark. That's not hype. That's data. So when whispers began circulating that league executives were discussing contingency scenarios for 2026, scenarios that revolved almost entirely around her participation, people started paying attention. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. The league's recent momentum isn't evenly distributed. It's concentrated. Intensely. And when growth becomes dependent on a single gravitational force, that force gains influence whether anyone wants to admit it or not. Sources close to league circles suggest that the upcoming collective bargaining negotiations have created a pressure point. The Players' Association is positioned to opt out. Financial structures are under review. Travel standards are being evaluated. Officiating accountability is under scrutiny. And suddenly, the most talked about player in women's basketball history is reportedly no longer content to simply participate in the system as it currently exists. She wants it adjusted. Not tweaked. Not politely reconsidered. Adjusted. The reason this matters isn't because athletes negotiating is new. It's not. Every professional league goes through tension cycles. Every generation pushes for better conditions. That part is normal. What isn't normal is the speed. In most leagues, it takes a decade of dominance before a player commands structural influence. It takes championships. It takes legacy. It takes years of sustained leverage. This time, it happened in one season. That's what has executives sweating. Because if the rumors are even partially accurate, if Clark has indeed communicated firm expectations regarding officiating standards, revenue alignment, and security logistics, then the league is facing something unprecedented. A second-year player with franchise-altering gravity. And here's the twist. She doesn't technically need the league the way previous stars did. Endorsement deals with global brands have already secured her financial independence. National advertisers view her as a ratings engine. Alternative league models are emerging, offering high-value short-format commitments. The global sports market is no longer centralized, which means the power dynamic is no longer traditional. For decades, the model was simple. The league controls opportunity. The players compete for position. But when a player becomes the primary driver of opportunity itself, the hierarchy shifts. Quietly, gradually, then all at once. That's why this alleged meeting matters. Because if the commissioner truly convened ownership groups and broadcast partners to discuss 2026 contingency planning centered on one player's satisfaction, then we are witnessing something far larger than contract negotiations. We're watching a system being stress-tested. And the tension isn't just external. Veteran players, many of whom built the league through years of financial sacrifice and international off-season grinding, are reportedly uneasy. Some see modernization. Others see imbalance. Some view it as evolution. Others interpret it as preferential restructuring. Inside locker rooms, the conversation is layered. Inside ownership circles, it's mathematical. Inside television boardrooms, it's existential. The question isn't whether Caitlin Clark is talented enough to command attention. That debate ended months ago. The real question is whether the WNBA is prepared for what happens when undeniable popularity meets unapologetic leverage. Because if 2026 becomes a tipping point, if the negotiations stall, if expectations clash, if pride interferes with pragmatism, the consequences won't be subtle. They'll be seismic. For the first time in league history, the balance of influence might not sit entirely in the commissioner's office. It might sit with the player wearing number 22. And whether the whispers are exaggerated or understated, one thing is clear. The honeymoon phase is over. Now it's about power. If this is your first time on the channel, and you want deep breakdowns that go beyond headlines, the boardroom angles, the leverage plays, the structural shifts shaping the future of women's basketball, make sure you subscribe. We don't just react to stories here. We analyze the pressure behind them. Like the video if you appreciate long-form investigations like this. It tells the algorithm this type of content matters. And leave a comment below. Do you think the league should fully adapt to its biggest star? Or should no player ever have this much influence? Because what comes next in this story might define the next decade of the WNBA. The first crack didn't happen in a boardroom. It happened on the floor. Night after night, possession after possession, the physical tone around Caitlin Clark felt different. Not just competitive. Not just intense. Different. Defenders didn't simply close out hard. They lunged. Screens didn't just brush. They collided. Drives didn't just contest. They sent her sliding across hardwood. And fans noticed. Clips spread across social media showing hip checks that looked late. Bumps that looked unnecessary. Closeouts that felt personal. Commentators debated whether it was standard rookie treatment or something more targeted. The league rarely addressed it directly. But the optics were undeniable. When a player draws record television audiences and then gets knocked to the floor in prime time with no whistle, the silence becomes louder than the contact. To veterans, this was the WNBA's identity. Physical, gritty, unapologetic. For years, players had fought to preserve that image. The league prided itself on toughness. It wasn't a finesse exhibition. It was professional basketball. But Clark's arrival introduced a complication. When the most marketable athlete in league history becomes the most hit player on the court, the equation changes. Stops being just about physical play. It becomes a risk assessment. Because if the star driving ticket sales, media negotiations, and sponsorship conversations suffers a serious injury, the consequences ripple far beyond one roster. And that's where insiders suggest the tone shifted behind the scenes. According to reports circulating in league circles, one of the firm expectations allegedly communicated for 2026 revolves around officiating standards. Not softer play. Not special treatment. Structural accountability. Transparent reviews of flagrant fouls. Clear escalation policies for repeat offenders. Public clarity on referee grading systems. A framework that protects elite assets without undermining competitive integrity. That distinction matters. Clark has never publicly asked for immunity from defense. She's built her brand on difficult shots and deep range. But there's a difference between competitive defense and unchecked escalation. And if you zoom out, the optics are even sharper. During her rookie season, arenas filled beyond capacity. Secondary ticket markets surged. Road games turned into home crowds. Television ratings spiked when she was featured. Merchandise sales reached historic levels. In other words, she wasn't just a player in the system. She became a revenue multiplier. And when revenue multiplies, risk tolerance decreases. That's basic economics. League executives understand that. Owners understand that. Broadcasters absolutely understand that. A generational draw is not something you expose recklessly. Which is why, if the rumors are accurate, the 2026 discussions aren't about favoritism. They're about sustainability. Because from a corporate perspective, allowing your primary growth engine to absorb disproportionate physical punishment without policy refinement isn't toughness. It's negligence. But here's where it gets complicated. Changing officiating standards affects everyone. Veterans who have built careers on physical perimeter defense aren't eager to see the whistle tighten. Coaches who pride themselves on gritty identity don't want games softened. And players who endured years of contact without special oversight may not welcome structural adjustments centered around one individual. Inside locker rooms, the reaction is layered. Some view it as modernization. Others see it as overcorrection. And that's the tension. If the league strengthens review protocols and implements clearer disciplinary escalations, it risks alienating players who believe the WNBA's physical edge is sacred. But if it doesn't, it risks exposing its most valuable asset to unnecessary danger. There is no neutral ground. And this is where the alleged 2026 line in the sand becomes more than rumor. It becomes logic. Clark endured a rookie season under a microscope. Every turnover amplified. Every foul debated. Every hard hit dissected frame by frame online. The psychological toll matched the physical one. National debates erupted weekly. Social media narratives spun out of control after nearly every contentious game. Being the face of a league means carrying its momentum. But it also means absorbing its turbulence. And at some point, even the most competitive athlete evaluates the environment and asks a simple question. Is this sustainable? Because if the growth of the league depends on her presence, then protecting that presence becomes operational strategy, not emotional response. That's the part critics often miss. This isn't about sensitivity. It's about scale. When an athlete is responsible for altering the economic trajectory of an entire sport in one season, the standards around that athlete evolve whether people are comfortable with it or not. The irony is sharp. For years, players fought for respect, for better facilities, for better travel, for better exposure. Clark's emergence accelerated all of it. But acceleration creates pressure. And pressure exposes structural gaps. The rookie season wasn't just a breakout performance. It was a stress test. And according to the whispers surrounding 2026, the conclusion of that test wasn't entirely flattering for the league's internal systems. If officiating accountability becomes a central demand, it won't be framed publicly as a concession to one star. It will be presented as modernization, as professionalism, as player safety reform. But make no mistake, the catalyst was visible every time she hit the floor. And while bruises heal, leverage compounds. Because what started as nightly physical play is now part of a larger negotiation ecosystem. A data point. A bargaining chip. A reminder that growth without protection isn't progress, it's exposure. And if the league chooses to treat those moments as routine rather than symptomatic, the consequences won't be limited to one season. They'll extend into the negotiations that define the next era. Because the breaking point wasn't dramatic. It was cumulative. And cumulative pressure is what reshapes systems. If the physical play was the visible tension, the money was the invisible one. Because while fans were debating hard fouls and missed whistles, something far bigger was unfolding behind the scenes. The WNBA secured a historic media rights agreement reportedly worth billions. Broadcast giants lined up. Streaming platforms invested. Corporate sponsors recalculated their projections. Analysts called it a turning point for women's professional basketball. But here's the uncomfortable math. The surge in national attention did not happen gradually over a decade. It spiked. And the spike had a name. Television ratings during Clark's appearances routinely dwarfed previous benchmarks. Road attendance records fell in multiple cities. Merchandise linked to her brand-dominated sales charts. Secondary ticket prices surged whenever she was in town. Social engagement metrics multiplied at levels sponsors couldn't ignore. That's not speculation. That's measurable. And yet, during this explosive financial growth, her base rookie salary hovered around $76,000. That number became symbolic. It was repeated on talk shows, debated on sports radio, compared to endorsement figures, used as a headline hook in mainstream media. The contrast between the revenue she helped generate and the paycheck attached to her rookie contract became a national talking point. Now, technically, that contract followed the collectively bargained structure. It wasn't personal. It wasn't malicious. It was procedural. But perception matters. And perception crystallized into one question. If the league is entering a multi-billion-dollar era, why does its primary growth driver earn less than many mid-tier corporate managers? That's where the 2026 leverage intensifies. The Players Association holds the ability to opt out of the current collective bargaining agreement. When that opt-out window opens, everything becomes negotiable. Salary caps, revenue share percentages, travel standards, benefits, profit transparency. And timing is everything. Negotiating structural reform during a stagnant period is difficult. Negotiating during peak momentum is strategic. Insiders suggest that Clark's camp understands that timing perfectly. Because leverage is strongest when alternatives exist. Her endorsement portfolio reportedly includes major global brands. That means financial security outside league salary. That means flexibility. That means independence. In past eras, players depended on overseas contracts during the off-season to supplement income. That created vulnerability. It tethered them financially to year-round risk. Clark doesn't face that same constraint, which changes the tone of negotiation. Rumors suggest that discussions around the next CBA may include a radical idea, tying compensation more directly to individual revenue impact. Not dismantling team structure. Not abandoning parity. But modernizing revenue alignment. That concept makes ownership nervous. Because the WNBA historically operates under a more balanced salary structure. It's designed to maintain competitive equity, to avoid superstar dominance financially overwhelming smaller markets. But when one athlete is demonstrably responsible for disproportionate economic acceleration, traditional balance models strain. If a revenue-linked compensation framework enters serious discussion, it would require unprecedented transparency. It would require ownership groups to reveal more detailed financial reporting. It would force recalculations across the board. And transparency makes some executives uncomfortable. Because once books open, narratives shift. From a business perspective, it's a risk analysis problem. If the league resists modernization and Clark chooses to reduce participation, or even temporarily sit out, what happens to those television contracts? What happens to sponsor engagement? What happens to franchise valuations that were just recalibrated upward? Momentum is fragile, and media deals are often structured with performance clauses. Broadcasters didn't invest billions for nostalgia. They invested for audience expansion. And audience expansion, recently, has been closely tied to one storyline. That reality creates pressure. But here's the nuance. This isn't simply about one player wanting more money. That framing oversimplifies the tension. It's about structural alignment in a league entering a new financial tier. When the NBA experienced revenue surges in past decades, player compensation adjusted accordingly. Salary caps rose. Maximum contracts expanded. Revenue-sharing formulas evolved. Growth triggered recalibration. The WNBA now stands at a similar inflection point, just compressed into a shorter timeline. The discomfort stems from speed. Veteran players spent years fighting incremental battles for better pay and improved conditions. Many feel that the current momentum was built on their sacrifices. That perspective isn't wrong. It's historical. But the acceleration created by Clark's entry altered the timeline. And when timelines shift, negotiations intensify. Some inside the league reportedly fear that accommodating significant structural financial change around one player could fracture locker room cohesion. Others argue that refusing to modernize would be short-sighted, because the league's brand value has already shifted upward. The question is whether compensation frameworks will reflect that shift. There's also the public relations dimension. If negotiations become tense and details leak, the narrative could quickly turn into a debate over fairness, equity, and exploitation. National media would amplify it instantly. Sponsors would monitor sentiment closely. The league cannot afford a messy public dispute during a growth cycle. Which means the $2 billion question isn't rhetorical. It's strategic. Does the WNBA treat the current surge as a collective tide that lifts all boats equally? Or does it acknowledge that one engine is producing most of the thrust? There is no clean answer. Because once compensation aligns more directly with individual impact, precedent is set. Future stars would negotiate from that template. Owners would recalibrate risk models. Union politics would shift. It would redefine the league's internal power structure. And that's why whispers around 2026 feel heavier than normal contract chatter. This isn't about incremental raises. It's about economic architecture. And when architecture changes, foundations tremble. The rookie salary figure may have sparked headlines. But the deeper issue is sustainability. If the league continues expanding media presence, increasing ticket prices, and promoting superstar-driven marketing, compensation structures must evolve to maintain credibility. Otherwise, the gap between value created and value received becomes too visible to ignore. And visibility fuels leverage. The physical play debate was emotional. The revenue debate is mathematical. And math doesn't care about tradition. It cares about ratios. Right now, those ratios are being recalculated. Quietly, carefully, and possibly urgently. Because when billions enter the equation, negotiation stops being symbolic. It becomes existential. The money raised eyebrows. The physical play raised concern. But the chaos off the court raised alarms. Because the WNBA was not structurally prepared for what happened when Caitlin Clark entered the league. It wasn't gradual hype. It was a surge. Airports flooded. Hotels swarmed. Road arenas transformed into spectacle zones. Security lines blurred. Fan access multiplied. And suddenly, a league that had operated on modest travel logistics was facing NBA-level visibility without NBA-level infrastructure. Commercial flights became flashpoints. Videos circulated of massive crowds waiting at terminals. Teammates navigating public spaces with minimal buffer. Fans pressing close for photos, autographs, reactions. For supporters, it was excitement. For operations teams, it was risk. When visibility explodes faster than logistics, vulnerability increases. And that vulnerability isn't hypothetical. High-profile athletes attract attention. Most of it positive. Some of it unpredictable. A tiny fraction of it dangerous. The problem isn't the majority. It's the margin. The WNBA's transition to charter flights was already underway, but the rollout was uneven and heavily debated. Cost considerations slowed implementation. Smaller market owners hesitated at the operational expense. For years, commercial travel was normalized. It was part of the league's identity, efficient, practical, grounded. But Clark's arrival accelerated exposure beyond historical norms. Reports suggest that one of the most firm expectations tied to 2026 revolves around travel and security guarantees. Not partial measures. Not temporary solutions. Full-scale modernization. Tier 1 private travel logistics. Dedicated security coordination. Controlled environments. Professional perimeter management. The kind of infrastructure typically reserved for billion-dollar global brands. Critics might argue that this feels excessive. Supporters counter that it's overdue. Because here's the business reality. If your primary ratings driver and marketing engine faces elevated security risk due to league-level exposure growth, failing to adapt isn't frugality, it's miscalculation. The images from crowded airports weren't just viral moments. They were operational red flags. And the league knows it. Behind the scenes, security consultants evaluate risk differently than fans do. They measure crowd density, reaction speed, emergency exit proximity, escalation probability. They run scenario models. When those models shift upward because of one player's gravitational pull, the operational budget must follow. That's where the tension lies. Funding full charter infrastructure across all teams requires millions in sustained annual expense. Smaller franchises operate on tighter margins. Owners argue sustainability. They point to long-term growth projections. They caution against overextending budgets. But from a liability standpoint, the calculation shifts. If an incident were to occur, even minor, the financial and reputational fallout would dwarf the cost of preventative investment. That's the uncomfortable truth executives must confront. And it's not only about travel. It's about accommodation standards, arena security layers, access control, online threat monitoring, personal safety coordination. Because Clark's fame doesn't turn off when the game ends. Her social media footprint extends globally. Her endorsements increase visibility beyond sports audiences. Her presence now crosses into mainstream culture. That expands the audience pool and unpredictability. For years, WNBA players navigated visibility within manageable bandwidth. Dedicated fans, local coverage, regional interest. Now the spotlight is national, possibly international. And infrastructure must match spotlight. If reports are accurate, Clark's camp has made it clear that stepping back into a system without elevated protections isn't acceptable long-term. Not after experiencing firsthand the intensity of exposure. Not after navigating the surge. This isn't about privilege. It's about scaling. When a league transitions from niche growth to mainstream acceleration, internal systems either evolve or strain. And strain shows. Some veteran players reportedly see the travel modernization push as beneficial for everyone. Better rest, safer environments, higher professionalism. Others worry about financial ripple effects impacting roster depth or resource allocation. Owners calculate line items. Players calculate well-being. Broadcasters calculate optics. And the commissioner stands at the center, balancing all of it. Because here's the paradox. The league wants the visibility. It wants sold-out road games. It wants trending highlights. It wants media attention. It wants corporate investment. But visibility without infrastructure is volatility. Clark didn't create that volatility intentionally. It emerged as a byproduct of popularity. But once it exists, it can't be ignored. And if 2026 negotiations formalize travel and security guarantees at a premium level, that signals a permanent shift in league operating standards. Not temporary accommodation. Permanent elevation. That has consequences. Operational budgets expand. Competitive parity debates re-emerge. Ownership contributions adjust. Long-term projections recalibrate. But ignoring the shift isn't an option. Because once an athlete reaches a certain threshold of fame, regression becomes impossible. You cannot unring the bell. You cannot reduce attention back to pre-surge levels. The system must rise to meet the spotlight. Or the spotlight will expose its weaknesses. That's the core of the security conversation. Not emotion. Not ego. Infrastructure versus exposure. And exposure is already here. The rookie season demonstrated it. The airport footage proved it. The merchandise lines confirmed it. The ratings data validated it. The question now isn't whether modernization is necessary. It's how far it must go. And whether the league is willing to institutionalize it before something forces its hand. Because when growth outruns structure, adaptation becomes urgent. And urgency rarely waits politely. If the tension were only between Clark and ownership, it would be simple. It isn't. Because inside the locker rooms, the reaction is far more complicated. For nearly 3 decades, WNBA veterans built this league without national hype cycles. They flew commercial for years. They played overseas in the off-season just to make stable income. They practiced in smaller facilities. They negotiated incremental improvements, one concession at a time. They earned everything slowly. So when a second-year player enters and suddenly the league restructures travel, renegotiates revenue models, tightens officiating standards, and shifts media strategy around one gravitational center, emotions surface. Not always publicly, but internally. Absolutely. Some veterans view Clark's leverage as progress. They see modernization accelerating benefits they fought for. They understand that star power can be a tool, not a threat. Others see imbalance. From their perspective, they endured years of physical play without expanded whistle protections. They accepted lower salaries without billion-dollar broadcast headlines. They fought through obscurity so the next generation could inherit stability. Now, they watch as that next generation commands systemic change almost instantly. It feels uneven. That emotional undercurrent is rarely spoken outright because professionalism demands restraint. But insiders suggest that the Players' Association discussions around the upcoming CBA are layered with subtle tension. Here's why. If compensation becomes more directly linked to individual impact, mid-tier and rotational players could see relatively smaller gains compared to superstars. If officiating adjustments are perceived to favor high-profile players, resentment could quietly build. If travel modernization is publicly framed around protecting one athlete, pride gets involved. And pride in professional sports is powerful. Some veterans reportedly worry that bending too visibly to one player undermines collective bargaining solidarity. The WNBA has long operated under a more egalitarian pay structure than men's leagues. It was part of the league's identity: shared sacrifice, shared benefit. Shifting toward a more superstar-driven economic model changes that culture. That doesn't mean opposition is universal. But it does mean the conversation isn't simple. Clark represents generational acceleration. Veterans represent foundational stability. When acceleration meets foundation, friction is natural. And the commissioner has to manage that friction carefully. Because if internal unity fractures during CBA negotiations, ownership gains leverage. If public narratives portray player infighting, sponsors grow cautious. If locker room cohesion deteriorates, on-court product suffers. The league cannot afford internal polarization right now. That's why much of this debate remains quiet. No one wants headlines reading "Veterans versus Rising Star." That narrative benefits no one. But tension doesn't need headlines to exist. It shows up in tone, in body language, in subtle comments during interviews, in the way negotiations are framed. There's also a psychological component. For years, veterans fought to prove that women's basketball deserved equal respect and financial recognition. They argued that the product was already elite. That exposure lagged talent. That the league deserved investment independent of one personality. Clark's meteoric rise complicates that narrative. Because the data suggests that one personality dramatically shifted mainstream engagement. That reality doesn't invalidate decades of effort. But it does reframe the timeline. And reframing history is uncomfortable. Some players might quietly ask, why now? Why not earlier? Why did it take one media phenomenon to unlock corporate enthusiasm that should have existed all along? Those are fair emotional questions. But business operates on attention metrics, not fairness. Clark didn't invent the league's value, but she magnified its visibility. And visibility converts into capital. Now that capital is being renegotiated, which places veterans in a complex position. Support modernization and risk internal imbalance. Resist rapid change and risk financial stagnation. There's no clean choice. Union leadership must navigate this carefully. If they appear to prioritize superstar leverage over collective equity, dissent grows. If they resist structural change too aggressively, they risk alienating the athlete driving momentum. It's a political tightrope. And politics inside professional sports can be more intense than any rivalry on the floor. Because once power shifts, hierarchy shifts. And hierarchy shifts affect identity. Clark isn't demanding cultural dominance. But her impact has already altered internal dynamics. Younger players see opportunity. Veterans see disruption. Coaches adapt strategies. Executives recalculate messaging. The league is evolving in real time. Some embrace it. Some brace against it. And that divide matters. Because if 2026 negotiations reach a tipping point, internal solidarity will determine the outcome. A united players' association negotiating structural modernization is powerful. A divided one weakens leverage. Ownership knows that. Broadcasters know that. Clark's camp likely understands it too. That's why the veteran reaction is more than background noise. It's a central variable. The WNBA built its culture on collective grind. Clark represents individual acceleration within that culture. The question isn't whether one is right and the other wrong. It's whether they can coexist without fracture. Because if modernization feels like favoritism, resentment grows. If tradition feels like resistance to progress, frustration builds. And if those two forces harden against each other, the league's greatest growth cycle could become its most delicate internal moment. The physical play debate was visible. The revenue debate was financial. This debate is emotional. And emotion, in professional sports, can shape outcomes as powerfully as contracts. The challenge now isn't simply satisfying a star. It's preserving unity while evolving. That may be the most difficult negotiation of all. For years, WNBA players had one professional home. If you wanted to compete at the highest level in the United States, you played in the league. If you wanted to increase income, you went overseas in the off-season. That was the ecosystem. Stable, predictable, limited. That ecosystem no longer exists. And that's what makes this moment different from every negotiation cycle before it. Because for the first time, Caitlin Clark doesn't just have leverage inside the system. She has leverage outside of it. New domestic league concepts have started emerging. Short-format seasons. Investor-backed ventures. High payout models built around concentrated star power. The structure is simple. Fewer games, bigger checks, premium visibility. Some of these leagues are still experimental. Some are investor-driven showcases. Some are backed by serious capital looking to disrupt the traditional calendar. But the existence of alternatives changes the psychology of negotiation. If you're dependent on one platform, you negotiate carefully. If multiple platforms are competing for your presence, you negotiate differently. Clark's financial independence through endorsements amplifies that difference. Multi-year brand partnerships with global companies mean she doesn't rely solely on league salary to maintain wealth or relevance. That removes pressure. And pressure removal creates freedom. Rumors suggest that conversations around alternative league participation, exhibition commitments, or shortened premium tournaments have quietly floated in the background. Nothing publicly confirmed. Nothing formalized. But enough smoke to alter the atmosphere. Here's why this matters. If Clark were to reduce her WNBA participation, even temporarily, the ripple effects would be immediate. Television ratings would recalibrate. Road ticket prices would normalize. Merchandise sales would shift. Sponsor campaigns would pivot. Broadcast partners would adjust marketing strategies. The momentum curve would flatten. That's not emotional speculation. That's trend modeling. Broadcasters invest based on projected growth. If the growth engine becomes uncertain, investment appetite cools. Ownership understands this. Which means the nuclear option isn't a threat that needs to be spoken loudly. It only needs to exist quietly. In previous eras, sitting out a season was career risking. Visibility dropped. Fan engagement faded. Replacement stars emerged. Narrative control shifted. Clark's situation is different. Her media presence extends beyond league games. She trends nationally regardless of game outcome. She appears on major broadcast panels. She headlines marketing campaigns. Her visibility is platform independent. That insulation reduces risk. And when personal risk decreases, negotiating confidence increases. This is where executives reportedly grew uneasy. Because once the possibility of external alternatives becomes credible, control dynamics shift. The league can't simply assume loyalty. It must compete for it. That concept feels uncomfortable in a structure historically built on player allegiance to the league's long-term mission. But markets evolve. Athletes now operate as independent brands. They are businesses within leagues. They measure ROI. They evaluate exposure value. They assess workload against compensation. If another venture offers concentrated earnings for fewer games with equivalent or greater visibility, the comparison becomes rational. This isn't about abandonment. It's about optionality. And optionality is power. The mere possibility of Clark exploring alternatives forces the WNBA to modernize faster. It compresses timelines. It accelerates negotiations. It removes complacency. Ownership groups that once felt insulated by structural monopoly must now consider retention strategies. How do you keep the most valuable asset engaged long-term? You provide competitive compensation. You provide elite infrastructure. You provide safety. You provide alignment. If those conditions aren't met, the market will offer them elsewhere. Some critics argue that alternative leagues lack stability, that they may not survive long-term, that the WNBA's legacy and brand equity outweigh short-term payouts. That may be true, but in negotiation theory, perceived alternatives matter as much as guaranteed ones. If Clark's camp can credibly signal that outside options exist, even if exploratory, that shifts bargaining power dramatically. The commissioner doesn't need to fear a confirmed exit. She needs to fear a credible possibility. Because sponsors and broadcasters react to possibility. And possibility alone can alter contract language. The existence of alternative leagues also intensifies veteran tensions discussed earlier. Some players welcome new platforms. Others see fragmentation risk. A divided talent pool weakens collective bargaining power. Too many leagues dilute product strength. But again, this is where Clark's uniqueness matters. If she participates in an alternative format without fully leaving the WNBA, she could expand the market rather than fracture it. That dual presence model is something executives are still learning to navigate. The modern sports landscape no longer demands exclusivity. It rewards versatility. And Clark's brand fits that versatility. The WNBA must now decide whether to treat her as a long-term institutional pillar or as a high-profile participant within a broader ecosystem. That distinction affects negotiation posture. If she is institutional, modernization is investment. If she is participant, resistance becomes defensible. But the numbers suggest institutional impact. And numbers drive boardroom decisions. The nuclear option doesn't require aggression. It requires credibility. And credibility, in this case, exists. That's why the alleged emergency discussions weren't about ego. They were about retention strategy. Because losing a generational growth engine during the most pivotal media deal era in league history isn't just disappointing. It's destabilizing. And destabilization during expansion is dangerous. For the first time, the WNBA isn't negotiating from a position of scarcity. It's negotiating from a position of growth. But growth is fragile. And when growth concentrates around one gravitational force, that force becomes indispensable. Unless alternatives are embraced strategically rather than reactively. The question now isn't whether Clark would leave. It's whether the league is willing to ensure she never has a reason to consider it seriously. Because the option alone has already changed the equation. Here's the part that changes everything. It's not just the league negotiating with a player. It's the league negotiating under the gaze of billion-dollar broadcast partners. When ESPN, Amazon, and NBC commit long-term money to a sports property, they aren't investing in nostalgia. They're investing in projected growth curves, audience expansion, cultural relevance, sponsor integration, engagement velocity. And recently, those metrics have had a very clear catalyst. Television data doesn't care about sentiment. It tracks viewership spikes. It tracks demographic shifts. It tracks social engagement conversion into live ratings. And during Clark's rookie season, those spikes were visible. Game-to-game swings correlated. Road markets experienced noticeable lifts. National broadcasts featuring her consistently outperformed baseline expectations. Broadcasters see that instantly. Which means when 2026 negotiations enter serious territory, the networks aren't neutral observers. They are stakeholders. If reports are accurate, executives within media companies have already expressed strong interest in ensuring continuity. Because a renegotiated CBA that destabilizes the league's primary growth engine doesn't just affect the WNBA. It affects programming schedules. It affects ad pricing models. It affects cross-platform promotional campaigns. It affects shareholder confidence. This is where the commissioner's role becomes nearly impossible. On one side, ownership groups managing operational costs and competitive balance. On another, Players' Association navigating internal unity. On another, veteran concerns about structural shifts. And looming above all of it, broadcast partners demanding stability. If Clark were to signal hesitation about 2026 participation, even indirectly, the ripple wouldn't stop at league headquarters. It would reach media boardrooms within hours. Because media deals often include performance expectations. Not necessarily player-specific clauses, but growth-based assumptions. If those assumptions weaken, renegotiation conversations quietly begin. And renegotiation is leverage. The networks don't need to threaten publicly. They simply need to ask questions privately. What does the 2026 product look like? What assurances can you provide? What contingency planning exists? Those questions alone create urgency. For years, the WNBA negotiated from a position of seeking exposure, convincing networks to invest, proving viability, demonstrating long-term value. Now, ironically, the pressure has reversed. The networks have invested, and they expect return. Clark's presence is closely associated with that return. This doesn't mean the league cannot grow beyond one player. But during transitional eras, stability is critical. Media partners want predictability during expansion. They want consistent narratives. They want star-driven marketing arcs. If internal league politics jeopardize that consistency, broadcast patience thins. Sponsors operate similarly. Major corporate partners align campaigns months in advance. Advertising schedules are mapped around anticipated storylines. Brand ambassadors are integrated into cross-platform strategy. If 2026 becomes uncertain, sponsors reevaluate spend allocation. And that reevaluation doesn't happen emotionally. It happens mathematically. If projected engagement drops by a measurable percentage, budgets shift elsewhere. The commissioner understands this. Which is why, if an emergency meeting occurred, it wasn't about pride. It was about reassurance. How do you reassure networks that the momentum they paid for will remain intact? You secure stability. And stability requires alignment. Alignment between league office, ownership, players, and broadcast partners. If any of those elements fracture publicly, narrative control slips. And narrative control during growth cycles is invaluable. There's also an optics dimension. If Clark's reported demands are framed as modernization, improved safety, updated compensation structure, professional infrastructure, and the league resists visibly, public sentiment may side with her. Broadcasters monitor sentiment closely. A narrative that paints the league as resistant to evolution could create reputational drag. But if the league appears to capitulate too aggressively, veteran players could feel undermined, creating internal instability. The commissioner must balance optics externally and cohesion internally while satisfying investors. It's an intricate calculus. And the clock is ticking. CBA opt-out timelines don't pause for comfort. Once formal negotiation windows open, positions harden. The networks will expect clarity long before the first 2026 tip-off. Because programming grids and advertising commitments require lead time. That's why this isn't just a basketball storyline. It's a corporate storyline. A growth story colliding with governance. Clark's leverage isn't isolated to ticket sales. It extends into broadcast valuation models. That's unprecedented territory for women's professional sports. Historically, growth in the WNBA was incremental, gradual, earned through persistence. Now it's accelerated. And accelerated growth magnifies every internal crack. The networks don't need to choose sides. They simply need assurance. If the league cannot confidently provide it, outside narratives will fill the gap. And in the modern media environment, narratives move faster than negotiations. That's why 2026 isn't just a season. It's a checkpoint. A validation of whether the WNBA can transition from breakthrough momentum to institutional stability without losing the engine that sparked it. The broadcasters are watching. The sponsors are calculating. And every conversation behind closed doors now carries more weight than any press conference ever could. At some point, every league faces a moment where influence changes hands. Not publicly, not ceremonially, but structurally. And what's happening around 2026 feels less like a negotiation and more like a shift. Because this isn't just about Caitlin Clark asking for better conditions. It's about what happens when a league realizes one player has outgrown its original operating model. For decades, the WNBA functioned within a controlled ecosystem. Gradual growth, shared visibility, collective branding. The league was always bigger than any single name. That philosophy built stability. But Clark's arrival disrupted scale. The numbers didn't rise evenly. They spiked around her. Attendance didn't gradually increase league-wide. It surged in specific markets when she played. Television didn't incrementally climb. It jumped during her broadcasts. That concentration of impact creates gravitational influence. And gravitational influence creates leverage. Historically, only a handful of athletes across all sports have reached that threshold. The kind where the league adjusts around them rather than the other way around. Michael Jordan didn't just win games. He transformed television scheduling and global marketing strategies. LeBron James didn't just change teams. He shifted franchise valuations overnight. Those weren't just superstar careers. They were economic inflection points. The uncomfortable question now is whether Clark represents a similar moment for women's professional basketball. Not in championships yet. Not in longevity yet. But in economic acceleration. If so, the traditional hierarchy changes. Because when an athlete becomes the central growth catalyst, the league must decide: protect the structure or evolve the structure. Evolution feels threatening to those who built the original system. But stagnation feels dangerous to those responsible for expansion. Clark's reported conditions, whether fully accurate or partially amplified, signal something important. She isn't negotiating from a place of insecurity. She's negotiating from visibility. That distinction matters. In past eras, players fought for basic recognition. Now the fight is about scaling to match demand. That's progress. But progress forces uncomfortable conversations. Should a league adjust officiating transparency when one player draws disproportionate attention? Should revenue models shift when one player drives disproportionate income? Should infrastructure elevate when one player creates disproportionate exposure? If the answer to all three is yes, then the league enters a new era. If the answer is no, then tension intensifies. Because leverage doesn't disappear once recognized. It compounds. The phrase, outgrowing the league, sounds dramatic. But in business terms, it simply means scale mismatch. If an asset grows faster than the system supporting it, recalibration becomes inevitable. The WNBA's recent growth cycle suggests recalibration is already underway. Charter travel expanded. Media partnerships expanded. Marketing budgets expanded. Now the question is whether governance expands with equal speed. And here's the deeper layer. This isn't just about Clark. It's about the precedent. If the league modernizes aggressively to retain its biggest star, future stars will enter under higher structural standards. Compensation models could evolve permanently. Security protocols become baseline. Officiating review systems tighten. That ripple would redefine women's professional basketball for decades. Clark becomes not just a catalyst, but a turning point. That prospect excites some. It unsettles others. Because once power shifts toward athlete-driven influence, governance adapts differently. The commissioner's office historically directed change. Now change may be responding to player gravity. That's a subtle but meaningful difference. And it doesn't require hostility. It simply reflects modern sports economics. Athletes today are independent brands. Social platforms amplify personal narratives. Sponsorship deals create alternative income streams. Fan loyalty often attaches to players more than franchises. That environment alters negotiation dynamics permanently. The WNBA is not immune to that trend. Clark just accelerated its arrival. Some critics frame this as dangerous. They argue no player should wield disproportionate influence. But markets reward impact. And impact is measurable. If one individual consistently multiplies revenue streams, stakeholders will adjust behavior around that individual whether they admit it publicly or not. That's not favoritism. That's economics. The real challenge is balancing that economic reality with collective identity. The WNBA was built on teamwork, shared growth, and incremental gains. Clark represents exponential growth. Exponential forces rarely fit neatly inside incremental systems. So this moment isn't just about 2026 contracts. It's about whether the league embraces exponential identity. Does it lean into superstar-driven expansion? Or does it protect egalitarian structure at the risk of slowing momentum? There's no villain in this equation. Only evolution. But evolution is uncomfortable. Because once a power shift occurs, returning to the old equilibrium isn't possible. The question isn't whether Clark wants control. It's whether her impact has already granted it. And whether the league acknowledges that quietly, or resists it publicly. Either path defines the next decade. Because this isn't a dispute. It's a transformation. And transformations don't ask permission. They happen when scale demands it. Everything feels calm right now. No public ultimatums. No official standoffs. No dramatic press conferences. But calm doesn't mean settled. It means waiting. Because the real pressure point isn't today. It's 2026. That's when the current collective bargaining agreement can be reopened. That's when compensation structures get re-evaluated. That's when travel standards can be formalized. That's when revenue-sharing models face scrutiny. And once that window opens, positions harden. Right now, conversations are flexible, hypothetical, strategic. In 2026, they become contractual. That's why the urgency exists behind closed doors. The league cannot afford to enter that negotiation cycle unprepared. Not after signing historic media deals. Not after expanding charter travel. Not after selling the sport as entering a new era. If 2026 begins with uncertainty around its most visible star, that uncertainty contaminates everything. Ticket pricing projections. Broadcast advertising packages. Sponsorship renewals. Expansion team planning. Momentum is a fragile asset. And momentum thrives on confidence. The Commissioner's challenge isn't simply satisfying Caitlin Clark. It's preventing a scenario where negotiations become public theater. Because once contract disputes spill into headlines, narrative control evaporates. If Clark's camp publicly frames discussions around safety, compensation alignment, or modernization, and the league appears resistant, public sentiment could tilt quickly. On the other hand, if the league appears to concede aggressively to one individual, internal pushback intensifies. There is almost no margin for miscalculation. And here's the reality that makes 2026 different from previous cycles. The WNBA is no longer negotiating from survival mode. It's negotiating from growth mode. That sounds like strength. But growth amplifies stakes. When expectations are low, conflict is manageable. When expectations are high, even minor instability feels catastrophic. The league has marketed this period as a breakthrough era. Ratings are up. Visibility is up. Corporate investment is up. The next negotiation cycle will determine whether that breakthrough becomes institutionalized or remains a spike. If the league evolves its structure, improving officiating transparency, adjusting revenue models, formalizing elite logistics, it signals permanence. If it resists significant modernization, it risks signaling fragility. Clark's leverage isn't built on personality. It's built on data. And data doesn't fade quickly. Even if she never publicly threatens to sit out, the possibility alone shapes conversation. Because stakeholders are aware of what her absence would mean. Not symbolically. Numerically. This is the part casual observers miss. Leverage doesn't require confrontation. It requires awareness. The league is aware of the ratings correlation. Broadcasters are aware of the engagement spike. Sponsors are aware of brand lift. Everyone in the ecosystem understands the equation. The only unknown is how boldly that equation will influence the next CBA. If 2026 negotiations lead to a restructured revenue-sharing formula, historians may point to this period as the moment women's professional basketball permanently recalibrated. If travel and security standards become NBA-level institutional norms, this era becomes the pivot point. If officiating accountability mechanisms become more transparent and standardized, player safety discourse shifts long-term. All of that traces back to one moment in time where scale exceeded structure. And the structure had to respond. But there's also risk. If expectations rise too high and negotiations stall, public disappointment could overshadow progress. If veterans feel marginalized, locker room cohesion could strain. If ownership resists too firmly, growth could plateau. Every path carries consequence. Which is why the most important question heading into 2026 isn't about personality. It's about adaptation. Can the WNBA adapt quickly enough to match its acceleration? Because acceleration without adaptation creates instability. And instability during expansion can reverse gains. Clark represents acceleration. The league represents structure. 2026 forces alignment. Someone will blink first. Either the league proactively modernizes to secure its momentum, or it tests how much momentum can survive tension. And that choice won't just affect one season. It will define the next decade. The headlines may focus on ultimatums. The real story is infrastructure. The rumors may focus on panic. The real pressure is mathematics. The debates may focus on fairness. The real issue is scale. And scale doesn't shrink quietly. It demands accommodation. The only question left is whether that accommodation happens strategically or reactively. Because once 2026 arrives, waiting won't be an option anymore. The clock is moving. Silently. Relentlessly. And when it reaches zero, the future of the league won't be debated on social media. It will be written into contracts. Whether every rumor is accurate or slightly exaggerated almost doesn't matter anymore. The power dynamic has shifted. Caitlin Clark didn't just enter the WNBA. She accelerated it. The physical play debates exposed structural gaps. The salary conversation exposed economic imbalance. The travel chaos exposed logistical strain. The alternative league whispers exposed optionality. The network pressure exposed financial dependency. Put all of that together, and you don't get drama. You get transformation. For the first time in league history, one player's presence is tied directly to systemic modernization conversations. Not because of ego, because of impact. The WNBA now stands at a crossroads. It can evolve into a fully scaled, superstar-driven billion-dollar enterprise with modern infrastructure and aligned compensation. Or it can attempt to preserve its older equilibrium and risk slowing the very momentum it fought decades to achieve. Neither choice is simple. But one thing is clear. The era of quiet growth is over. This is the era of leverage. And 2026 will decide how that leverage reshapes the sport. If you've made it this far, you already care about more than just box scores. You care about how power moves behind the scenes shape what we see on the court. Our channel is still growing, and the number of subscribers is honestly very low compared to the depth of analysis we bring. If you want more high-level breakdowns like this, where we dissect the business, the leverage, the negotiations, and the future of women's basketball, hit subscribe. Liking the video helps the algorithm understand that long-form, detailed sports analysis deserves visibility. And I want to hear from you in the comments. Should the WNBA fully adapt around its biggest star to maximize growth? Or should no player ever hold this level of structural influence? Because the answer to that question might define the next generation of the sport.